Well, I thought there's an interesting column this week that Jonah Goldberg put out in the Los Angeles Times, as well as others, where he talks about the American media. And he says there's a couple of the things that are happening here. First of all, the American media are not nearly as influential as they think they are. They're not as important as they think they are. They are stuck in their own echo chamber. So the Jacksonians of the world, the mamas, are not on Twitter. They're not on Blue Sky, right? They're, the people who are the never Trumpers are hearing from other people who are never Trumpers. And one of the things that he talks about is the fact that the Democrats and the media specifically have a bootleggers and Baptists problem. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but the idea was prohibition was one of these laws that was deeply unpopular for most of America, but it was popular with two factions that should be at odds with one another. One was the bootleggers, who, they love prohibition because they get to sell more moonshine. And the Baptists liked prohibition because they wanted to see alcohol not be a part of our society. And Goldberg says that this is part of the problem with journalism, that they not only hold themselves in such high regard, not only do they overemphasize their importance, they have to be the fact checkers. Otherwise, if they can't prove themselves to be important, then they're going to fall away. What's my point at all, right? For existing. And so that's one of the problems that they're having. And what I think has happened is, again, those within the elite evangelical framework have been kind of stuck within this echo. They've listened to these folks who have said, we are the important ones. We are the ones who have our finger on the true pulse of the world. And they believe that. They bought their propaganda, if you will. Whereas, you say this wide swath of Tocquevillians and Jacksonians, which makes up a significant majority of America, I would say, it's completely divorced from what they think reality is.
Yeah, no, I think that is, and that's where elites, and by the fact of being elites, they just don't swim in the same waters as every day, or what we say, the rank and file. And I think we certainly, in my area, in the education world, the people who send their kids to colleges and pay the bills have very different lives and experience than the administrator or the class of people who are running the institutions. And so sometimes there's a disconnect, if you will, in that. And I think we see that in reactions towards Trump. And like, just anecdotally, I'm sure you guys can point to things as well where there are people who are just never Trump, no matter what. You can almost peg kind of what their professional commitments are, their lives are, and then you talk to a bunch of people like, yeah, I don't really like him, I don't like some of what he stands for, but my kid is going to school, and these crazy policies are affecting them. My job, I have to go to these DEI meetings in my workplace, and so they see the effects of kind of this kind of left-wing culture that Trump has like declared war on, and they're like, well, I don't love him, but he seems to be like fighting the things that I want to fight. Whereas the elites are kind of sheltered, or maybe insulated, maybe that's a better word, from the effects of the kind of leftist problems. And so that takes us in the area of crime as well. Like, elites are likely to live in neighborhoods that are pretty safe and protected. The rank and file are living in neighborhoods that are subject to crime and drug use and all these things. And you have, like in LA out here, you have Gascon who's saying, oh, we're not going to prosecute petty theft. It's like, well, for the rank and file, and this crosses, religious and non-religious lines, but for the rank and file, hey, they're the ones shoplifting from my store or shoplifting from the store that I work in, and they're hurting the bottom line. And so,
Yeah, I'm tired of having to call a clerk in order to get the shampoo unlocked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I just think elites are somewhat detached from the day-to-day vagaries of a culture that doesn't resist the decline that people are just seeing around them. And so in the evangelical world, like, well, we'll forgive some of Trump's coarseness. We'll forgive even, other things, as long as he kind of fights the things that we feel are deteriorating in our society, that they're bringing down our society. And so there is a defensive posture to this, I think. And I mentioned that offhand, that there is a defensiveness, and so that'd be interesting to talk about at maybe some later point. Like, evangelicalism is somewhat predicated on an offensive posture of spreading the gospel and changing the culture. There is somewhat of a defensive posture to this, and I'm not sure how that plays out long term.
Yeah.
Well, and let me ask you both though. So what happened in 2020 then? How is it that Biden was able to squeak by? Who blinked, I guess? Why did they blink? And was it Biden's policies and the effects of the inflation, the trans, that was just became so overwhelming that they realized it doesn't matter which Democrat is in there at this point in time, we just can't have it? Or is it, as some have claimed, that it was two women that lost to Trump and not a man? So, I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Logan, I'll let you start out.
Way to go for it. It's obviously because it was two women. It has nothing to do that they're probably the most disliked women in U.S. history. I'd probably argue. Well, before I get into that, I do want to make one prefatory comment about the previous point, and that is a conversation about what makes someone an elite. I think this is a conversation that probably should be talked about, at least openly. In American society, it's always been argued it's a classless society. We don't have nobles, we don't have lords, we don't have anything. But like, I was talking to a friend of mine a few days ago, and we were talking about politics and pastors or something like that. Politicians and pastors. I said, yeah. I said they tend to, butt heads a lot, like COVID. But it's just funny that you have these two aristocratic elements, going at it. And they like stop, like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, like, a pastor kind of is an aristocratic element. And they're like, I've never heard that before. I'm like, well, like the priestly classes and, the distinctions between, being someone of the earth, being someone of this spirit, or, and we started having this conversation. Like, I've never really considered any of these things. Just bring it up. Like, some people think you're an elite if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of land, but it's actually not the case. You can find people of the earth that have lots of money and lots of land. This is the whole debate about like tech is like this weird sort of like, can you be not elite but be like engrossed in like cybernetic questions? And anyways, point being is that there should be a conversation about what makes someone an elite, because it really then uh, helps us understand the differences of what people are seeing. And a perfect example is this, like the CEO of United Healthcare being shot. Not saying you should or shouldn't do it, but the reaction is interesting because you can tell who deals with insurance on a daily basis and who does not deal with insurance on a daily basis, if nothing else. And so this is where you see a perfect example where like the people who are slogging through healthcare claims, car insurance claims, your iPhone insurance claims have one very deeply disdained view of insurance. And then people who are like, but we're process oriented, and you do your tickets and you make your appeals through court, and you're like, you make your legal disputations, and those, it's a very different view of the world. And then when tragedy strikes, the way in which they receive very physical changes of events is very different. So anyways, that was a prefatory comment, but the point about what happened, I think it ultimately came down to two things. One, which Dr. Guerrero has repeatedly said, is this regrouping of the sort of like this multi-ethnic working class. It's interesting because even the unions did not come out, at least the union administration. There was so much resistance to Kamala that even the union administration was like, we have to be careful about giving our endorsement. We'll just not endorse, which was a huge move, which hadn't been done in years.
They heard from their constituency. Yes. That and they knew it. Yeah, I was staggered by that. That was amazing.
Which is you go Teamsters and these sorts of things, these are people of the earth finally getting kind of their hands on the throat of the administration and being like, then don't say anything. And they did. They bent the knee. and did not make their endorsement. So I think one of it was this sort of like reorientation of this labor class. And I think the other one was just very simple. Like Kamala is like very, very dislikable. Like she doesn't talk well. People hate her through and through. Democrats hate her through and through. The way she climbed up in California politics, people hate that. People don't like being. She's very disdainful of people who disagree with her. Um, she was like when she ran for the presidency, she was the first one out, and it was just because Tulsi Gabbard was like, like when you did that interview about smoking pot at the time you were arresting people for doing it, she was like, oh ha ha ha. It's like, lady, you do not get what you're doing. And so it's yeah, very dislikable, but also there is this reorientation of the labor class.
Well, yeah, that's and um, Lenny, you had brought up why did Biden do better? Um, I think part of it is he was nominally Catholic. I'm not Catholic, so I'll let them comment on that. But he puts himself out there as a Catholic, and he does have this, I would say, veneer of the blue collar Joe thing. And so I think a certain number of voters were maybe won over by that, and so I think it did help him in 2020 with a certain number of people. What one thinks of whether those are genuine elements to who he is as a person, I'll let them decide. But I think that did help him. And again, 2020 is really an outlier year. I mean, we were going through COVID. Biden was barely on the campaign trail. Remember, he was campaigning. They were talking about he was campaigning from his home or whatever,
Yep,
right?
yep,
He was never
yep.
out there because of COVID. Of course, we can't really get him out there, and so it was just a really, really weird year.